Music theory with OneNote, modal chord inversions, comparing and contrasting the traditional system for naming inverted chords, focusing in on the note name for both the tonic of the chord and the inversion point, with a more streamlined modal chord system for naming inverted chords, focusing in on the modal point for the chord name and then the distance and modal whole steps for the inversion point, this time looking at the minor chords, those being the inverted chords built off of the Aeolian node, the minor scale, the Dorian node, and the Phrygian node. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 1385, OneNote Modal Chord Inversions, Minor Chords, list of presentations on the right-hand side. Also noting in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend our time on music theory, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation, or multiple presentations, where we build these tables in Excel, practicing not only our musical skills, but our table visualization skills as well. We're focusing in on the chord creation and on the inversions in particular, but a quick recap of the traditional naming convention. It's a mess, it's a mess. But a little bit more detailed recap, remembering these are going to be the extensions that we would typically be building from a 3-note, 4-note, 5-note, 6-note, or 7-note chord, but they don't really give us the context of which nodal point we would build these extensions off of. This is a problem because they're based on the note name instead of on the collection of notes that we're working in. And they're also comparing everything in essence to a major scale, which comes up to a complete mess with these ugly extensions and these unnecessary buckets of the dominant 7 diminished, half diminished. So for example, in the major bucket, you would think we would have chords built off of the Ionian node, or the Ionian, Mixolydian, and the Lydian nodes. But not all of those 3 are in the major bucket. Some of them are going to deviate from that bucket off of the major nodal points when they have the extensions over here on the major extensions. And then in the minor bucket, you would expect these would be all of the notes from all the chords built off of the Aeolian node, or the Aeolian, Dorian, and Phrygian node. But it doesn't even fit all of the chords built off of the Aeolian node. And we're going to have, once again, some of them that are going to break out as we add notes into the minor extension bucket. And then they had to come up with a whole nother category for the dominant 7, which are going to be like major chords, chords that are built off of the Mixolydian mode. The first one still fits into the major bucket, but then all of the rest got its own bucket. And then we had to have 2 extra buckets, diminished and half diminished, to deal with the Locrian node. So this is a complete mess, doesn't give us context about what we're actually playing in relation to the song. What we would like to do is be able to know the collection of notes that we're playing in the song, or the part of the song that we're working with, and then build the chords off of the relative nodal points, so that it gives us more information about the context of the song. So for example, this is our fretboard, low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top. And if we build a chord such as something off of this Mixolydian node, then I would like to know not just that it's going to be a major chord, but that it's going to be built off of the Mixolydian node. Now, if I build a chord that I'm seeing as a Mixolydian chord, but the lowest note, or the bass note in terms of pitch, like say this D, is also in the chord, then I might call that some type of inversion. Sometimes people won't call it an inversion. They're just going to call it, a major chord of some kind, or a Mixolydian chord. But if we want to be more specific, we can call it a type of inverted chord. And that's where we get the first inversions, the second inversions, and so on and so forth. So in a colloquial format, we're thinking it doesn't rewrite the whole order of the chords, but it tells you which note is on the bass position or the lowest pitched position. So we thought about that in terms of, notice how the chords are getting very ugly very quickly, because you already have a naming convention that's not very efficient, and now when you add to it the inversions, particularly if you add the inversions in an inefficient way, like naming not the distance or scale degree, but rather the note point, you get even more ugliness and you get more complexity if you want to transpose the song. If we were being as efficient as possible, what we would want to do is write the music in such a way so that it would be automatically and easily transposable to all 12 collections of seven notes, and be able to give us context about the song, meaning it tells us whether we're playing a chord off of a note that is in the collection of notes or outside of it by simply the note name that we're working with, and it's shorter and easier to kind of basically deal with. Also, when we think about these inversions, we would like it to be uniform through the collection of notes as well as to all of the different 7-note or collections, all 12 7-note collections. So for example, this Lydian, if I had a 7-note Lydian chord, you get this basically ugly name, an F major 13 sharp 11 and then /C. Both the F and the C are not going to be easily transposable if you want to transpose the song to a different 7-note collection, and it has an extension, it's long and it's ugly. It would be streamlined to say something like a 7 Lydian / second modal whole step, or a Lydian 6 modal whole step / second inversion. And so that's going to be the idea. We're going to continue on with that with the minors now. So we'll just continue on with that idea, and we'll say, okay, let's imagine that we're going to build note chords off of the Aeolian node. So if I scroll down here on the fretboard, that would be in the collection of notes around the key of C, the A. Now, if I'm up here and I'm using this A and I do a traditional bar chord leaning forward, that then has the root in the bass position or lowest pitch position. But if I build off of this one, for example, and say I pick up this C, this A, and that E, or the Aeolian, the Ionian, and the Phrygian, now the Phrygian is on top. Now, most people will still just call that like an A minor chord or an Aeolian chord, but we might want to be more specific and say, no, look, I'm going to tell you the inversion point or the lowest note that is going to be on top. How could we do that? Well, normally they might say it's an A minor. This is a 7-note chord because I'm going to use the most complex chord construction and then trim it down to easier chord constructions, because if you have a 7-note chord, then you're going to have 6 possible inversions. And then if you only have a 3-note chord, you have the first way you write it and then 2 possible inversions other than that, right? So if I have an A minor flat 13 / C, I had to add an extension to get that 13 in there, and then they told us it's a C instead of saying it's going to be a distance in scale degrees, which would be more efficient if it was scale degrees, because again, that would be at least a little bit transposable. But you can kind of see, like on a guitar, why that might happen, right? You're playing this thing, you're going to say the A is here, and I grab this C up top or this C down here, and so I'm going to say that's in the lowest point, that's in the bass. But I'd rather be able to see it by the nodal point that I'm grabbing, Ionian, or the distance that I'm grabbing as well, because again, that will also be more transposable. So we're going to say that I would rather call it a 7-note Aeolian / first inversion, or an A6/1, which would be an Aeolian 6 modal whole step first inversion. So that means you're going to make a 7-note chord off of the Aeolian, and you're going to go to the 1 modal whole step up, and that's going to be the inversion point, which would be from Aeolian to the Ionian. The Ionian, therefore, is going to be the lowest note. Now remember, in colloquial talk, that just means, hey, look, I'm going to put the Ionian on top. Now, if you're just noodling around and you're like, I don't really remember the distance terminology to call it the first inversion, which represents 1 modal whole step up, then you could just say it's the Ionian node, right? Instead of calling it a C note, I'm going to name it by the nodal point, or node number 1. because the relative positions, again, are going to be more efficient for me to be, particularly on a guitar, navigating around the guitar with. Okay, but it would be more efficient, particularly if you put this into sheet, like write it down or put it into a computer or a DAW to name the distance point in modal whole steps, because again, that will be more efficient when you do the same system through all modal points and through all collections of 7 notes. If I do the second inversion, I would call that an A minor flat 13, but now the inversion is going to be the next note in the collection of notes, which would be the second inversion, which under normal speak doesn't really tell you anything in terms of distance, right? You have to just know that the second inversion is going to be on like the third note of the chord. But in this convention, it makes more sense. It would be a 7A/2 or an A6/2, which stands for a 7-note Aeolian chord second inversion. The second inversion here stands for 2 modal whole steps up, meaning you're on the root, you go 2 modal whole steps up, which would be going from Aeolian to Phrygian, 6 to 3, and then you make the Phrygian the lowest note. That would be the point of inversion. So then, so you could also call it an Aeolian 6 modal whole step distance term second inversion. Okay, if I go to the next one, we're going to say it's going to be the third inversion. Normally A minor flat 13/G, because the third inversion point happens to be nodal point 5, which in the collection of notes around the key of C would be a G. But it would be more efficient to call it a 7-note, a 7A/3 or an A6/3, 7-note Aeolian third inversion, or Aeolian 6 modal whole step third inversion. The third inversion simply means go 3 modal whole steps up from Aeolian to Mixolydian, and that's going to be the lowest note, the point of the inversion. And then if I go to the next one down, we're going to say it's going to be the fourth inversion, A minor flat 13/B, because the fourth inversion happens to be nodal point number 7, which in the collection of notes around the key of C will be a B, but it would more easily be said as 7-note, a 7A/4 or A6/4, which is a 7-note Aeolian fourth inversion or an Aeolian 6 modal whole step fourth inversion, meaning you make an Aeolian chord and you invert on the fourth modal whole step, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is the Locrian node that we would invert on. And again, if you know your fretboard by nodal point, it's all transposable, and I can memorize my fretboard. If I go down to my fretboard, I've been practicing more and more, by the way, without all of the junk. I don't even put the letters in there anymore. I just put the number 1 through 7 of the nodal points. And that's it's so much cleaner to visualize the guitar by nodal point. It really, I think it'll increase the capacity to memorize the fretboard like massively, right? So then if the next one is going to be the fifth inversion, which would be an A minor flat 13/D, because we're going to go to the fifth inversion, which is nodal point number 2, which is a Dorian, which happens to be in the collection of notes around the key of C, a D. I'd rather easy be called a 7A/5 or A6/5, which is a 7-note Aeolian fifth inversion or an Aeolian 6th modal whole step 5th inversion, which means that you're going to invert on the 5th modal point up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5th modal whole step up, because we take every other modal whole step. So that would be that one. And then lastly, we could invert on the 5th, invert the 6th, that should be a 6. This should be on the 6th inversion, which would be an A minor flat 13/F, because the last nodal point that we would invert on is 4, which is Lydian, which in the collection of notes around the key of C happens to be an F. It would better be called a 7A/6 or an A6/6. That should be a 6, which would mean a 7-note Aeolian 6th inversion or an Aeolian 6th modal whole step 6th inversion, meaning we're going to go up 6th modal whole steps from the root of the chord, and that's going to be the lowest note in the chord, the point of inversion, which in this case is a Lydian, which happens to be in the collection of notes around the key of C, an F. All right, so let's go to the Dorian. Same thing with the Dorian. So we would say, all right, it's a 7-note Dorian chord. If it's a 7-note Dorian chord, then normally we would call that a D minor 13 if we're looking at the collection of notes around the key of C, because the Dorian note happens to be a D note. And then if I do the first inversion, it's going to be the second note in the chord in normal naming convention, which is modal point number 4, Lydian, which happens to be an F. I would rather call it a 7D/1 or D6/1, which stands for 7-note Dorian chord first inversion, or a Dorian 6-modal whole step first inversion, meaning we're going to go 1 modal whole step up from Dorian to Lydian and invert on that, making the Lydian the lowest note, which of course is once again the F in the collection of notes around the key of C. All right, then the next one, if I did a second inversion, D minor 13/A, because if I go 2 notes up from the chord, that's going to be nodal point number 6, which in the collection of notes around the key of C happens to be an A. I'd rather call it a 7D/2 or a D6/2, 7-note Dorian second inversion, or a Dorian 6-modal whole step second inversion, meaning we're going 2 modal whole steps up from the root, from Dorian to Aeolian. Aeolian, therefore, is going to be the lowest note, the point of inversion. Next one, we're going to say it's a third inversion, which is a D minor 13/C, because the third inversion point happens to be the Ionian, which will be in the collection of notes around the key of C, a C. I'd rather call it a 7D/3 or D6/3, which is a 7-note Dorian chord third inversion, or a Dorian 6-modal whole step chord third inversion, meaning we're going to invert on the third modal whole step up from the root, what happens to be the Ionian in this case. All right, so then will always be the Ionian. So then we have the fourth inversion, which is a D minor 13/E. So if I go 4 notes up, we're going to have that will be the Lydian node, the Phrygian node, which happens to be an E in the collection of notes around the key of C. I'd rather call it a 7D/4, D6/4, which is a 7-note Dorian 4th inversion, or the Dorian 6-modal whole step 4th inversion, meaning go 4 modal whole steps up and invert or make that the lowest node, which will be the Phrygian node, nodal point number 3. So then next we have a 5th inversion, which is a D minor 13/G. So if we go to the 5th inversion up, it happens to be a Mixolydian, which will be in the collection of notes around the key of C, a G note. I'd rather call it a 7D/5 or a D6/5, 7-note Dorian 5th inversion, or the Dorian 6-modal whole step 5th inversion, meaning we're going to go 5 modal whole steps up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which will land us on that Mixolydian node, that being the lowest node, the point of inversion. All right, and then we have the next one, which would be the 6th inversion, which would be a D minor 13. It should be slash the 7 node. It should be a B right there. I don't know, we lost the B, but I'd rather call it a D7. So we lost the thing here. It should be a 7D/6 or a D6/6. All right, let's go to the next one. We'll try to get through all the way through to the Locrian here. So we're going to say 7-note chords off of the Phrygian. So the Phrygian in the collection of notes around the key of C happens to be an E note. So if I'm building a Phrygian chord, if it's a 7-note chord, it's going to be an ugly one. It's going to be an E minor flat 13 flat 9, and then I'm going to then make the inversion point on the first inversion, which would be the second note in that chord, which will be nodal point number 5, which happens to be a G in the collection of notes around the key of C. Now again, this whole thing is long, it's ugly, and it's not transposable, gives us no context about the song, whether the chord is built off of a note that is within the song, within the key of the song, or outside of it. it would be nicer to call it something like it's a 7p/1 or a p6/1, which would be a 7-note Phrygian first inversion or a Phrygian 6-modal whole step first inversion, meaning go 1 modal whole step up from the root, which happens to be the mixed Lydian, make that the lowest note, the point of inversion. Then we have the next one. Hold on a second. We go here, we're going to say this is going to be a second inversion. E minor flat 13 flat 9/B, second note up, which is nodal point number 7, happens to be a B in the collection of notes around the key of C. I'd rather call it a 7p/2 or a p6/2, which would be a 7-note Phrygian chord second inversion or a Phrygian 6-modal whole step chord second inversion, meaning go 2 modal whole steps up, landing on the Locrian node. That's the lowest note or point of inversion. Next, we have a third inversion. E minor flat 13 flat 9/D, because we're inverting on the third note up from the tonic, which happens to be nodal point 2, Dorian node, which is a D in the collection of notes around the key of C. I'd rather call it a 7p/3 or p6/3, 7-note Phrygian chord third inversion or Phrygian 6-modal whole step chord third inversion, meaning go 3 modal whole steps up from the tonic, which will be the inversion point. This happens to be on the Dorian node, all right, which happens to be a D in the collection of notes around the key of C. So then we have the next one, which will be the fourth inversion. So it's going to be an E minor flat 13 flat 9/F, because the fourth note up is the Lydian node, and in the collection of notes around the key of C, that happens to be an F. But it would better be called a 7p/4 or p6/4, which would be a 7-note Phrygian fourth inversion or a Phrygian 6-modal whole step fourth inversion, meaning going 4 notes up from the Phrygian, which lands me on the Lydian, that being the lowest note or point of inversion. So then we have the fifth inversion, where once again I have a 6 here, I should be a 5, but E minor flat 13 flat 9/A, meaning we're going to invert on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth note up, which is the Aeolian node, which in the collection of notes around the key of C happens to be an A. I'd rather call it a 7p/5 or a p6/, and that should be 5, which would be a 7-note Phrygian fifth inversion or Phrygian 6-modal whole step fifth inversion, because that should be a 5, meaning go 5 modal whole steps up, which lands me on the Aeolian. That'll be the lowest note in the chord, the point of inversion. And then we have the sixth inversion, which would be an E minor flat 13 flat 9/C, because when I go 6 up, I land on the Ionian node, which happens to be in the collection of notes around the key of C, a C. I'd rather call it a 7p/6 or a p6/6, which is a 7-note Phrygian and 6th inversion, or a Phrygian 6-modal whole step 6th inversion, meaning we go 6 modal whole steps up from the root, which lands us on the Ionian, making that the lowest note or point of inversion. Let's lastly go to the Locrian, which isn't a minor mode, but is more minor than major. So we'll end it off here. This is the diminished mode. So normally, if it's a 7-note diminished, now in the collection of notes around the key of C, the Locrian node happens to be a B. So we would be calling a 7-note chord a B half diminished 13. And then if it's the first inversion, we're going to make the second note in the collection the lowest note, which would be nodal point 2, Dorian, which happens to be in the collection of notes around the key of C, a D. I'd rather call it a 7N, N standing for Locrian because it's backwards, taking the last note /1, or an N6/1, 7-note Locrian chord, first inversion, or Locrian 6-modal whole step chord, first inversion, meaning we're going to build the chord and go 1 modal whole step up to the Dorian node, making it the lowest note, the point of inversion. Next, we have a second inversion. So that would be a B half diminished 13/F, because we would go 2 notes up, which is nodal point 4, which happens to be in the collection of notes around the key of C, and F. I'd rather call it a 7in/2 or in6/2, which would be a 7-note Locrian second inversion, or a Locrian 6 modal whole step second inversion, meaning go 2 modal whole steps up, landing me on the Lydian, making it the lowest note in the chord, the point of inversion. So then we could make a third inversion, which would be a B half diminished 13/A, meaning the third note up from the collection of notes is going to be the nodal point 6, which happens to be in the collection of notes around the key of C, and A better be called, it would be better to call 7in/3 or in6/3, which would be a 7-note Locrian third inversion, or a Locrian 6 modal whole step third inversion, meaning go 3 modal whole steps up from the tonic, taking us to the Aeolian, that being the lowest note or point of inversion. Then we have a fourth inversion, which would be B half diminished 13/C, because if we go 4 modal whole steps up, that's going to be the Ionian node, which in the collection of notes around the key of C happens to be a C. I'd rather call it a 7in/4 or in6/4, meaning 7-note Locrian chord fourth inversion, or Locrian 6 modal whole step fourth inversion, meaning go 4 modal whole steps up, boom, landing on the Ionian, make it the lowest note or point of inversion. So next we have then a fifth inversion, which would normally be called a B half diminished 13/E, because the fifth note up lands on the nodal point number 3, which is the Phrygian point, which happens to be in the collection of notes around the key of C, and E, I'd rather call it a 7in/5 or in6/5 for a 7-note Locrian fifth inversion, or a Locrian 6 modal whole step fifth inversion, meaning we go 5 modal whole steps up from the root, landing on the Phrygian, making it the lowest note, the bass note, or the point, which is the point of inversion. Finally, sixth inversion, B half diminished 13/G, because that lands us the fifth inversion on the Mixolydian node, nodal point number 5, which happens to be in the collection of notes around the key of C, a G, but it would better be called a 7in/6 or in6/6 for a 7-note Locrian 6th inversion, or a Locrian 6 modal whole step 6th inversion, meaning we go 6 modal whole steps up from the tonic, landing us on the Mixolydian, it being the lowest note in the chord, the bass, the point of inversion. So notice the basic point is this. See how if I go from this column all the way down, you see how kind of ugly this is going all the way down. And if I was to measure this going across all collections of notes, meaning I can think of it going diagonally, the naming convention for all collection of notes, it would be ugly, because again the note names would be changing as we go through the 12 collections of 7 notes. Whereas this, you can see is pretty clean, somewhat uniform. You can see just by the shape of it all the way down, right? And except that's a typo. Don't. And if you were to move this same thing through all collections, all 12 collections of 7 notes, like horizontally, if you imagine that, it would still be it would be the same, right? You would have, like, I don't need to change this at all in order to move it through all the different collections of notes. Why? Because when you put it into a DAW or write it down or put it into sheet music, like with traditional sheet music, we would want to be saying and telling it the key that piece of the sheet music is in. Therefore, it would all be transposable, making the data input easy, also making it easy for us to rotate the song, both in terms of the collection of notes as well as in terms of possibly modal perspective, changing the tonic as we do basically modal rotations. So that would be way easier to do and understand what is happening when we do that, if we wrote it in a more efficient type of way. By the way, also note that you might say, well, what if I have a song that has notes that are outside the key? and chords that are outside the key or built-on notes outside the key, and or a song that changes the collection of notes. That's fine. Just like as you had in sheet music, if you change the collection of notes, then you're just going to say that this part of the song here has a different collection of notes than this part of the song, but always viewing the song or each piece of the song from the perspective of one particular collection of notes. That's just traditional way that you view music, even in more complex kind of improvisation strategies such as jazz and blues, for example. Now, if you were to build a chord on a note outside the collection of notes, that's what we'll touch on next time. But again, you can still use the same kind of convention, meaning what I'd like to do then is name the nodal point, one of the 5 notes that are outside the collection of notes, and then name the structure of the chord, meaning is it a major chord or a minor chord, which I would define as Ionian or Aeolian, and possibly more specific if you wanted to be, meaning it could be a Dorian or a Phrygian, which has an interval difference and so on and so forth, which we've seen in a prior course or section. And once we do that, we can easily just tack on the next concept of inversions, meaning then we could just choose the inversion point in the same fashion as we have done here. Remembering that in a DAW, we would want to be more specific about the exact inversion that's taking place. Colloquially, if this was a first inversion, instead of the Locrian being the lowest note in the chord, because it's a Locrian chord, it would be the Dorian, and then all of the other notes I'm not so worried about as long as I know that I'm seeing it as a Locrian chord and that the Dorian is the lowest note within it. But in a more specific method, like in a DAW, I would want to be able to say, no, if it's a first inversion, it's going to be in this order: the Dorian, then the Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, and the root or tonic will be the highest pitched note in it. And then if I want something that would put this Dorian as the lowest note, bringing it down an octave, but have this one the second one, and then in the same order, what I'd like to do is have a different convention where I can do that in a DAW. So in a DAW system, I think that we should be able to do something other than chord stacking, being able to compress each octave basically together and be able to write chords into the system, at least the fundamental chords, and we could easily make more complex chords without having to stack by just making normal rules such as the rules for inversions and such as a rule to lower any one of the notes. So I can just say, look, just make it the normal ordering and then lower that D one octave down, or bring it up 1 octave up and leave all the other ones the same, right?